start by asking you about critical macrofinance, which you define as both the political and historical exploration of the relationship between finance and the state at the macro level. So, basic questions: what are the key tenets and the major actors involved in macrofinance? And also, what does critical entail in terms of questioning and historicizing received ideas of what constitute a consensus?
Okay, so critical macrofinance is, I would say, a relatively new kind of theoretical framework for understanding contemporary capitalism. It is new in the sense that it's gotten this name recently through a body of work of my work and several other colleagues. But its main insights and instincts go back to as far as Hyman Minsky and even before him. And basically, the idea is that in order to understand macroeconomic policy, so we start from the macroeconomic institutions of the state, you need to think very carefully and to trace structural changes in the financial system. So macrofinance, in the critical macrofinance, is this Minskyan understanding of the dynamic interaction between the institutions of the state, the macro institutions of the state, the central bank, the treasury, and we will see also the institutions of the welfare state and the transformations of the welfare state, and the financial system that could be bank-based, as in most of your credit is created and most of the money is created through traditional relationship banks, or more market-based finance, where you have a much broader ecosystem of financial institutions which are doing some kind of credit creation through capital markets or alongside banks who create credit through traditional means. So that's the macrofinance. It goes back to Hyman Minsky. The critical in there comes from my particular understanding, or wanting to understand how this organic evolution of the state and finance happens, this relationship. It's fundamentally, it's a theory about the relationship between the state and capital, in particular financial capital, but not exclusively. And this relationship doesn't evolve in some kind of, linear way. There is a lot of political struggle around it. And this political struggle sometimes leans on changes or generates changes in the institutions of the state. Sometimes it generates changes in the institutions of finance. That's the kind of basic explanation of the critical. A broader understanding, as you alluded to, looks at historical trajectories and broader political changes over decades or over regimes, if you want. And we can talk about neoliberalism, about post-neoliberalism, about the post-Second World War Keynesian consensus of some sorts. And why do I think it's important to have critical macrofinance? Well, as an analytical lens, when I started my doctoral research was on the role that the Central Bank of Romania played in the transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based economy. And what I understood from studying that period from 1990 to roughly 2009, what I understood is that a lot of studies of neoliberalism don't pay much attention to the central bank in particular. The central bank is in some ways, neoliberalism achieved a great, I would say, ideological coup, if you want, because it portrays central banks as institutions who are technocratic, who are in charge of price stability, and we shouldn't think about them. And therefore, our political economy analysis rarely thinks of central banks as very important political actors. And I would say most analysis of neoliberalism ignore the central bank. And what critical macrofinance does is to say, well, we have, when we think about state institutions, we shouldn't only think about elected politicians and the choices that they make under particular constraints, but we should think about the ways in which those choices are produced through political struggles in the relationship with the central bank. Particularly because neoliberalism has also been for a very long time associated with a period of financialization, with a period of the increasing structural and infrastructural power of the financial system. And you can't understand that process of financialization without understanding the role or thinking conceptually about the role of the central bank. So I would say that's the three very important sets of actors that we have: is the state, the Treasury, that is the political fiscal arm of the state that takes decisions about spending on welfare or on industrial policy. More recently, that makes decisions about taxation. And then you have the central bank, whose relationship with financial capital has become closer and closer over the last 2 decades, I would say in particular, in a way as a form, and maybe we'll talk about it more, as a form of resolving particular political problems and institutional problems that neoliberalism poses for the state and for its macroeconomic policymaking abilities.
And then there's the private financial actors too.
Yes.
Regardless of which system we are, they have a role, a different one in each one. But that's also one of the key actors.
Exactly. So besides the institutions of the state, then critical macrofinance looks at the ways in which private finance organizes itself as an ecosystem, the different kinds of actors and the different drivers in that political or in that ecosystem. I would say shadow banking is an interesting example of the necessity to think about the organic changes in financial structure.
Can you tell us more about, for people who wouldn't know, what shadow banking is?
Okay, shadow banking is a term that popped up in political discourse with the global financial crisis in 2008. I remember that there was in 2000, after the global financial crisis reached its most intense with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 in the US, and then it kind of spread everywhere around the world. In 2009, the US politicians decided to have a financial inquiry commission, and that financial inquiry commission needed to find a villain for the global crisis, and the villain that they came up with was called shadow banking, and that's how we started thinking about shadow banking, because all of a sudden he was the villain that kind of brought down nearly the global financial system and the global economy with it. And there are many different ways in which one can think about shadow banking. We first thought about shadow banking as a process of securitization, where you take, and it became famous globally with the collapse of the subprime mortgage market in the US in 2007, when we discovered that securitization, which is you take, for example, mortgage loans created by banks, you take them, you put them in a special purpose vehicle, and you issue debt securities, bonds that you can trade, that have different ratings, and you can sell them to different financial institutions with different kinds of risk appetites. This process of securitization was supposed to diversify risk. This is how it was sold in the United States. Then we discovered that it basically concentrated risk. So that's one way in which we thought about securitization, about shadow banking first, that it was this kind of obscure process of producing liquid or seemingly liquid assets out of illiquid loans. Then the definition became broader and broader, because once you started to work out why Bear Stearns, for example, collapsed in 2006, or why Lehman Brothers collapsed, then the world looked at shadow banking as a process of creating credit through capital markets and financing them through a market that is very dear to me, that is very technical, the repo market, where you can take your bonds and finance them by borrowing against them as collateral. So shadow banking is a process of credit creation and intermediation and financing of those credit activities in new markets and through new instruments, sometimes involving directly the regulated banking system, sometimes not. Another way to think about it, and I would suggest Zoltán Pozsár, Hungarian economist, became very famous by producing what he called a map of shadow banking in 2010 with several other colleagues, but he kind of stayed in our consciousness as the guy who produced the shadow banking map. And if you look at it, it looks like a circuit of this little a board where you have all these different types of institutions connected to each other. It looks very complex, that map. And a way to simplify it is to say, well, in a financial system where you have growing what we call institutional cash pools, that is, financial institutions that are amassing large cash because that cannot be covered by a standard deposit guarantee, which in the US used to be $100,000 and now is $250,000. If these institutions want to hold that cash, they can't hold it in a bank deposit because this bank deposit is basically unsecured exposure after the upper limit of the deposit guarantee. So what shadow banking does is it creates financial instruments which which meet this demand for safety. And how does it do that? Well, it brings this demand for safety together with demand for leverage from leverage-hungry financial institutions like hedge funds or other kinds of bond funds. So another way of thinking about shadow banking is to say there is a growing set of cash-rich institutions who are entering trading relationships with cash poor but leverage-hungry financial institutions, and shadow banking produces the instruments, the money-like instruments through which these two sets of institutions can basically coexist and meet each other's needs. It's a term that kind of went out of fashion in 2015, and it went out of fashion because to my mind, and that's where critical macrofinance is a useful way to think about it, because the reform of the shadow banking system that was a political priority after the global financial crisis kind of started to lose steam after 2010 to 2011, once policymakers realized that the state and its macroeconomic institutions were at the core of the shadow banking system. That for the decades of what we call neoliberalism, they had together, the state had kind of entered a shadow banking pact with shadow banking institutions. They together created what I call an investibility pact or a liquidity pact for government bonds, a pact for the functioning of central banks under inflation targeting regimes and under independence. And in order to reform shadow banking, you had to reform the state. And it's very difficult to reform the state, although now it seems to be at least a political horizon that it's easier to contemplate. But after 2008, the idea that you have to reform the institutions of the state, the way in which the central bank works, the way in which the Treasury works, the relationship between them, that didn't come across as a political possibility, and therefore we dropped the reform of shadow banking in order to not have to reform more broadly the neoliberal institutional pillars of the state.